Good afternoon and welcome. And thanks, Marjolein, for the introduction. I couldn't emphasize that more. Performance is not always about getting the best of the best every day, constantly. But I will tell you a bit more about that in a minute. My story today will be life-changing. Personally, I think it's rather bold to start with your story like that. But honestly, I do believe firmly in the fact that when you really implement everything that I try to convey to you today, that this actually can be life-changing, or that you already changed your life in doing that already. So let me get to that. But first, core message, it does take effort. It takes attention, it takes reflection, it takes effort to build your mindset. And that effort doesn't come for free. Although it does get easier. The moment you build your mindset, it gets easier over the course of time. But honestly, it is not for everyone. I mean, because it takes effort, because reflection takes effort, it's not for everyone to do these steps because they just mean a lot from your own system. And I will talk a bit more about that in a minute. Tips are plenty. I mean, go to YouTube, type in tips on improving my life, and you find it. Chunking, batching, atomic habits, comfort is the enemy, you name it. You get plenty of tips, and most of those videos are very informative. I won't go into that today. I won't go into the how. I will go into the what and the why. So my story is about the deeper layer. Why is it important to build your mindset? What is important regarding building your mindset? I believe you can find the how for yourself quite easily. So what do I mean with performance? I mean, Marjolein already lifted the veil a bit. I mean performance in the broadest sense of the word. I mean performance at your work, for your tasks, your competencies. But I also mean your relationship with your colleagues. I mean your performance in your private life, your lifestyle, the way you deal with your food, your nutrition, your physical activity, but also how you deal with your loved ones, how you deal with your social circle, the hobbies you maintain. So performance in the widest sense of the word. So today is about performance, but I will be showing you trees instead, because I love trees. Honestly, I think this is the best picture of a tree I ever made. This picture I made myself. I'm quite proud of it because I think it's a beautiful tree. This is an ancient 2,000-year-old olive tree in Greece. And as you can see, it's a big one. I mean, it's more than 9 meters in circumference. It's heavily rooted. You know, the core is empty. You see that it's firm, reaching into the sky with the branches reaching up. And for me, such a tree is a very strong analogy to us as humans. I mean, if you're well developed as a human, psychologically, but also biologically, then you're rooted firmly in your social system, and everyone can see that. And you're a landmark in your surrounding. So that's my feeling with trees, and that's why I will be showing you some trees today. Honestly, I think if you want to benefit best from this lecture, take out your phone, put it on focus mode, on flight mode, turn off notifications, whatever to do in order to not get disturbed, because that's the first level of control that you have. And let me start off by asking you a question in that sense, because performance often comes from how we deal with events in life. And the question I want to ask you is to name your most dramatic life event. And I will start talking about my most dramatic life event first to also give you an insight in my life events. My father, he died in 2011. I mean, I was barely 25 years old and we lost him because of a mental illness, and he decided to leave this world on his own. And obviously that's a very dramatic event. What I experienced from that is that following that event, first, I was having problems a number of times with a number of things, but eventually I started working on myself because I knew I needed to deal with a number of emotions and a number of patterns that weren't healthy. And a life event can turn out negative, but can also turn out positive. And that life event gave me one of the most beautiful gifts in my life, and that's my direction of attention inwards, to find myself. I see Johanna saying the same, sudden death of my father, death of my aunt. I see Marco saying car crash, Abs says grandfather passing away. Matteo, heartbreak, also a big life event. Yvonne says losing my son. Oh, that's terrible, Yvonne. Losing your son, losing your child is, I think, one of the worst things that can happen to you. Robert says working for a narcissistic person. Yeah, that's also not a nice one. Been there, done that. Miscarriage, depression, burnout. So you see a lot of life events in the chat, and thanks for openly sharing these. In seeing these events, we notice how much bad events can come our way. But it's the way you deal with them. And that also determines your performance in the broadest sense of the word. And that's what I will be talking about. But as a neuropsychologist, first we're going to talk a little bit about the brain. I mean, I can talk half an hour about the brain if I want to, but I'm going to shorten it down to a couple of minutes. And how to better do that with the dragon tree. The dragon tree is a native tree species. It's in the Caribbean, and it has this very typical two hemispheres, two brain halves. And it has the roots underneath, which is basically the strong patterns in the brain and the reptile brain, the more rudimentary brain that was always there. And then on top it has the leafy elements, so the needles, and that basically resembles the neocortex. That's the part of the brain that was developed last in our evolution. Well, that's a nice analogy, I think, because this brings to bear the System 1 and System 2 thinking. So Daniel Kahneman, he is a psychologist. He won the Nobel Prize for economics in 2002. Quite remarkable with his theory on System 1 and System 2 thinking. System 1 thinking is rapid, emotional, reflex thinking. So basically, someone falls off a chair and you look back and try to see what is happening there. Someone says a nasty remark and you react impulsively. That's System 1 thinking. It's based on emotion. It's based on reflex. System 2 thinking developed later in life, in our evolution of us as a human species. That's the prefrontal area of the brain. That's System 2 thinking. That's the type of thinking where you have to think harder, put effort into it, where you have to reflect, where you need to focus. That type of thinking I will be pointing to a lot today. And then there is a third element in your brain. That's the default mode network. That's the network that is active when you're not doing anything. And that's a very typical network that is very useful for resting and for archiving. And these three systems are important. So I will summarize them shortly and I will refer to them in my story a number of times. The first one is the reactive system, fast system, emotional system. The second one is the reflect system, the focus system that costs effort. And the third one is the rest and archiving system, the default mode network. Well, let me take you into the model. The model basically of us as a human being, the way I view it. On the left you have the blue, you have lifestyle, which leads to vitality. You have physical activity, sleep, and nutrition. On the right side you have mindset, the way we think, the way we deal with things, the way we have opinions about things, our attitude towards things. That's comprised of attention, habits, and rest. And in the middle we have the core, our being, our essence. I will focus today on the green elements because the blue part is basically part of another story, the biology of performance. But I show you the model nonetheless because I think it's important to see how the two support each other. And I will start with talking about attention. And how to better do that with a beautiful tree. When I'm walking in my neighborhood, then sometimes I come across a park, and in that park I see this specific tree. It's a pine tree. What I like about this tree is that it always invites my attention to check out the tree. I think it's a very beautiful, majestic, big tree. It has a big trunk with a beautiful bast around it. The branches are very typical. And always when I'm there, my attention shifts towards it and I focus on what I hear, what I smell, the resin of the tree, what I see, and what I feel with that. And why is attention so important, you might wonder? Well, basically, attention is quite rare. Our brain focuses primarily on System 1 because that takes no effort. It works on automatic responses, on heuristics, and you just go with the flow and your brain does the work for you. That's what we typically as human beings like to be in System 1. So attention just gets based on what our brain does and what our brain gives us and by our surroundings. But attention is also getting rare, and that has to do with technology. I mean, we all have our phones and our technology surrounds us, and especially social media companies, they try to harness our attention as long as possible because that earns them money. That's their existence. And because attention is getting rare, that can become problematic. So attention is the only thing that we actually have really control of, and we need to focus that. And why is that focus important? Because focus brings you a lot of things. We all heard about multitasking. Multitasking doesn't exist. Multitasking is nothing more in neuropsychology than task switching, very rapidly switching between tasks. We cannot do two tasks of the same modality at once because that's multitasking. Reading two articles at the same time, impossible. Focusing on two conversations at the same time, impossible. So the task switching that you need to do, that comes at a great cost. It takes time. So the moment you're focused, you're actually saving time up to 40%. You reduce stress because a lot of task switching costs stress. And you focus on improving your quality by being focused on one task. And that's a very important element. So that being said, let me give you an example of where attention comes into play very nicely of my own life. One of these things is having conversations and building relationships. As a coach, I know how important it is to build rapport, to tap into a good relationship with the person you're talking to. When I was a lot younger, I often found myself thinking about different things when I was in a conversation. And actually, by being in a different line of thought while in a conversation, the other person notices, and you won't have that good rapport. And as a result, you won't be focusing on building very good relationships. So I give you a number of attention points that are important for harnessing attention. And the first one is focus on what you want. So try to focus on one thing only, and go for that. The moment you're doing that and you leave distractions aside, you will experience growth and development. And that brings me automatically to the second point, manage your distractions. Your distractions you can often control. Your phone, for example. Turn it off. Make sure you don't get distracted by it, that you don't touch it when you're focused. When you have children and you want to work on writing your book, make sure that you go to a place where your children cannot distract you, if that's possible. At work, don't answer your mail the whole day. Make sure that you do that 2 or 3 times a day, and the rest of the day you focus on the things you want to do. Third advice is do it now. The now is all we have. You have yesterday, it's the past, you cannot change it. You have tomorrow, it's yet to come, you cannot do anything about it. The now is where we can act. The now is where we have our control when we focus our attention. That's a very important element. Then try to make choices. I mean, when you make a choice, one door closes, the other door opens. Choices have consequences. We all know that, but when you accept the consequences that belong to a choice and you really stand behind that choice, you can go further. I often see people experiencing problems making a choice, or when they made a choice, experiencing problems accepting the consequences. Make choices, stand behind them, focus that attention. And the last advice I want to give you is give attention to the right things. I did my coaching degree at the Alba Academy in the Netherlands, and one phrase that really tapped into me was, what gets attention will grow. And that's positive and negative. What gets attention will grow. So the moment you're putting a lot of attention in your mind on something that possibly might happen, then it gets a lot of attention, positively and negatively. So make sure to give attention to the right things and make sure that's positive, because that will tap into your focus. One example of that is building my own career. Usually when I want to get somewhere, I'm focusing on one thing. And I already did that and experienced that in the past when, for example, I doubled the number of years in my high school. And in the end, I was kicked off from high school. I was a dropout. And not because I wanted to, but because I didn't get to the results I needed to have. And then in the end, I noticed that when I wanted to get further in life, I needed to focus on my studies. And that became at some point my primary focus. And from that point onwards, I was studying nominally. I got to my PhD and everything worked out. And a couple of years ago, I read the book of Gary Keller, The One Thing, and he really focused on that. You have one thing, you focus on that. You can do that per month, per week, even per day. And if you're doing that, you will notice consistent change. Back to distraction, to highlight how important distraction is in that sense, to avoid it, is that distraction is 15 times more costly than health-related absenteeism in the workplace. So basically, when you look at research, they clearly provided statistics around the cost of distraction. So we all know health-related absenteeism, right? You're being sick, people have a burnout, people have to take care of their loved ones, and they get health-related absenteeism. And we all know that that can be quite a large cost. Well, distraction is 15 times more costly. And even when they corrected for a piece per rate scheme, so where employees get paid by what they deliver instead of by the hour, distraction is still 5 times more costly than health-related absenteeism. And I think these figures speak for themselves. All right, back to the model. What we see now is that we discussed attention, but attention alone obviously doesn't build the mindset. It's also about your habits. Your habits truly build into the mindset, and putting attention to the right habit, that will work out. I'm also shortly looking at here to scroll a bit below. Thank you. And then if we look at the mindset and the habits, how can I better show that with a tree again? Because one of my favorite habits is mountain biking. I love sports, and that also really taps into the rest system. I told you about System 3, the default mode network. You can actively rest by just staring at the window, but you can also do something physically and have your brain rest while you are physically active, or actively focusing on what you eat instead of reading while you eat or working while you eat. Usually on Sunday morning, I go for a mountain bike, and the moment that I can do some mountain biking is oftentimes on Sunday morning. What I like about that is that the moment I'm really out there, I'm feeling energized. I feel really good about doing it. But oftentimes with exercising, I don't feel like going. So when Sunday morning comes and it's early morning and I wake up, I just don't have a feeling of getting up, getting on the bike. It's still gray outside. You don't really feel like going. But I made this habit, an agreement with myself, that I decide the day before if I go or not, and that only depends on the weather. So if it really is raining cats and dogs and it's unhealthy to go out because it gets too cold, then I'm not going. On all other accounts, I will be going. And then when I agree with myself that I'll be going, in the morning I just get up and I go. And the moment then comes that I'm on my bike for like 20 to 30 minutes and I come at this point on my fixed route. And I see this tree, and I stand on my pedals, and I look over to the cornfield on the left, and I see this very typical, beautiful Limburgian landscape with this church. And then I always think, I love it, and I went. And I didn't do that in the past. I wanted to go exercise, but I didn't always do it. So I made a habit of intentionally deciding beforehand what I'm going to do about it. That really taps into the habits. And that also taps into flow, because that is another trick to come to that habit. Flow is a state of being in which you become so immersed in the joy of your work or activity that nothing else seems to matter. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi came to that definition. I will tell you a bit more about it in a moment, but think of this definition. When are you so immersed in work or an activity and feel so much joy that nothing else seems to matter? Can you think of that? Then please answer the next question in the poll. How often do you experience the state of flow? How often? Let's see if some results come in. And in the meantime, I'll tell you why flow is so important, or why habits are so important. Because habits basically build your mindset, the way you think, your attitude, your opinion. That all dives into your mindset. So basically, your habits are essential. Well, if we look at the vote, we already see 150 votes in. We see that 40% experience flow multiple times a week. That's great. We also see people, 6% almost never, 10% once a month, some people every day, 8%, but most people, let's say the majority, says once a week, multiple times a week, or multiple times per month. That's really great. That's good. And I think it would be great if you can even experience that on a daily basis. So let's see how flow taps into that. But let me first start with the habits in general. The most important habit, I believe, is to become goal-oriented. And with goal-oriented, I mean to have a positive, constructive goal that you work towards. That's an important habit, that you actively use System 2, think about where you want to go, tap into that, and project it yourself on that. Second element is be proactive instead of reactive. So the moment you're proactive, you're thinking about things first and then dealing with it. If you're reactive, you're just using System 1, reflex type of response, and that's it. I got into a divorce 2 years ago, and obviously that's also a life event that, I didn't want to happen. Unfortunately, it happened, and using these habits, we came out of that really good. We're still very well together. We have a son who's 5 years old, and obviously that also means that you need a partner who is willing to chip in the work. But if I look at these habits really got me there. So another habit that is important in that regard is practicing Stoicism. So Stoicism is a philosophy for life. It's one of the most ancient philosophies, but it's a really easy get to it philosophy. And it is based on a number of pillars. And I will explain the most important ones now. First one in Stoicism is logical thinking and knowing yourself. The Stoics believe that using logical thinking, you get to know yourself. And once you know yourself, you can really tap into the control where you can exert it. I will come back to that in my third element of the core as well. Another important element that the Stoics believe was perception as the only reality. So it's not the real world and the reality that everyone agrees on, but it's your perception. That is your reality, because that's what you see. And the way you perceive things is also the way you interpret the world. So if you think about that, you can also change your perception and hence change your reality. Another important element of the Stoics was that change is inevitable. Things will change. You will lose a loved one. You will get sick. You will at some point have financial loss. Things will happen in life, and that's how life is. So you need to expect adversity and think about logical things that will happen, so you're prepared to them when they happen. If you do all that in Stoicism, in the Stoic beliefs, then there is one thing that remains, and that's control. The Stoics believe that where you can exert control, you should do it, and where you cannot exert control, you should accept it. And that's an important element. Accept the things that lie outside your focus of control. For instance, you're in traffic and someone makes a weird action on the road and you're getting involved in that. You can get mad, you can lift your arm or even point your middle finger or whatever, but that doesn't help you. You couldn't change the behavior of that person, and it could well be a mistake. And even if it wasn't, there's nothing you can do about it, and your reaction to it also fuels your mindset. A fourth and important habit is get into flow. I promise to get back on that, so I want to show you this graph and explain it to you. As said, Csikszentmihalyi, a researcher of flow, he defined flow as that state of being, of immersion and feeling joy in your task or activity. He posed the following. If your skill is really high for something, but your challenge is low, you will expect boredom. If your skill is not so good and your challenge is too big, you will experience anxiety. But in between, where the match of challenge and skill is good, you will experience flow. And the higher you go up the chart, the more intense the flow will be. Just as an example, when I am developing a lecture, for example, in the beginning it's big. I have one idea about this lecture and I want to put it there. But then the challenge is very high. And although perhaps my skills are okay or perhaps even high, I still experience anxiety because the challenge is just too big of making that grand lecture. But when I chunk it into pieces, and I think one of the important elements is this element, for example, Stoicism, I want to talk about that, then it gets easier to talk about that. Then the challenge gets easier, it fixes into my skills, and I get into flow, and I experience joy while developing that. So in that way, on a daily basis, I can get to consistent growth in that lecture, and it's easy to finish, and it's fun to do. So getting into flow is a very important habit, if you ask me, in every day-to-day business. I mean, putting up the laundry is not the most fun task, but when I have my son over, he's 5 years old, and we make a fun exercise out of it, that we do a little dance and sing a little while we are hanging the laundry, then it gets fun and we get into flow. It takes us 3 times the time it does take me when I do it alone, but I mean, we're at it anyways. Then the last element is practice self-compassion. Compassion is the definition where you don't only feel empathy for another person, but also act towards that empathy. Self-compassion is compassion towards yourself. So being compassionate and dealing with things that happen to you in life in a compassionate way, in an honest way, in a truthful way. Practicing that self-compassion is very important. By now you might think, well, Jérôme, okay, it's a lot of things, you know, attention, habits, and you still haven't got to your core. A lot of things we need to do for our performance. True. That's why compassion is so important. We cannot be at our peak performance every moment of the day, every day today. And you also shouldn't want that. I mean, it's basically fine to have a bad day, to at some point be tired. Probably when I get home from my entire day, I'm also tired, and I'm gonna relax. I'm gonna use that system 3, you know? I'm gonna tap into the rest and the archiving. Practice that self-compassion. That's a very important thing. In the end, when you look back at the model and you think about habits, there might be some signals where you can get the feeling, okay, my habits are not really into order and tapping into my mindset. One of those signals could be not knowing where you go. Being negative is one of the signals, being in a negative state. Having the feeling that life is overwhelming, or really not getting into a productive state. Another signal could be being hard on others or yourself. And that brings me to the final element, and that's your core. And if you look back at the model, you also see rest in there. I talked about attention and habits, tapping into your mindset, but that rest is also important. While eating, being physically active, but also just staring outside a window from time to time and just letting your brain rest. It's perfectly fine. Leave that phone out of it for a while. Well, if we get into the core, I have another tree picture, and you might recognize this tree. This is a tree I started with. It's a 2,000-year-old ancient olive tree. It's located in the island of Aegina, 1.5 hours by ferry out of the coast of Athens, the capital of Greece. And here I stood in the center of the tree, and the core was basically hollow, but the tree was still there, you know? It was actually, the whole core was surrounded by tree, and I love this picture. You look up, you see all the scars of life on that tree. You see the sun, the bird's nest, the branches reaching out into the sky. And you might wonder, why are you telling me this? What is important in this regard with the core? Well, that's basically because I was there last summer with my former girlfriend. And we had a great holiday. I mean, we were madly in love. We had a lot of fun. It was beautiful weather. It was especially very hot. I mean, it was 37 degrees. We needed to walk for 2 kilometers to get there. But when we got there, I was feeling like, wow, I'm just so happy that I'm here. And to me, this picture afterwards resembles something completely different. It resembles knowing what I want versus not getting it. Because I wanted to continue in that relationship, and she wanted it too. But we also were very closely connected to our core, and we noticed that things weren't matching. And because things weren't matching, eventually we broke it off. And to me, this picture really resembles that. So what is important in relationship to your core? I think what is important is, first of all, knowing your life goals. Where do you want to be in life? And not in terms of I want to be there, and then I want to be there, and then I want to be there. I don't mean a rat race. I mean really at your core. What is it that gives you most pleasure in life, most gratitude, most satisfaction? Knowing your life goals can actually bring you to more connection with your core. And that, in return, can also lead to knowing your driving forces. In the workplace, there are great models in getting to know your driving forces. You have driving forces analysis. I did a number of them, and they all give you more insight in what really drives you, what motivates you, what gives you passion. Knowing these and making explicit what you are about gives you more insight in who you are and where you actually thrive. So that's also the importance of the core, is actually knowing where you want to be. In the end, if you know your core very well, you can actually select the environment that fits you, and that makes for a happier life. Third element is knowing your core values. So in the end, you also want to know your core values. What do you value most? Is that the value of aesthetics? Is that a value of companionship? Is that a value of hospitality? What values do you value most? There are very easy and accessible sources in getting to know these values for yourself. But be aware, oftentimes we select values that are not truly ours, but our parents or our primary caregivers or important people that we know from our childhood. So make sure they're really your core values. Then the fourth element is staying true to your core. Once you know your core better and made that explicit, it's important to stay true to it. And you can do that by challenging your beliefs. Oftentimes, from our childhood, we incorporated patterns in our psychological system, in our mindset, that were effective then, but not now anymore. And we all experience that as adults, that we walk into a wall inwards from ourselves that doesn't really operate anymore. So it's very important to challenge these beliefs and to transform ineffective mechanisms to better mechanisms. And oftentimes coaching comes into play there because it's very difficult for people to do that on their own. Last element, if you did all that work, it's way easier to be authentic. And the moment you are authentic, it's way easier to get into the environments where you fit best. So for example, this doing what I like, bringing such a message across is something I really want to do, that I really experience satisfaction from. This didn't get to me instantly. It also needed attention and knowing these goals, making that explicit in order to get there. So some signals that you might experience when you're not really at the core of your being is not really knowing where you're going, or not knowing what really drives you, or not even knowing what you really appreciate. So oftentimes you're not feeling in the right place, and that's a clear signal of you not being close to your core. And with that, I end this session, and I invite you to ask questions or upvote the questions you like best, and let's talk about it in the Q&A. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Jérôme. Really interesting. It also immediately raises for me, like, okay, so many interesting insights, and Jérôme is so right, but how am I going to apply this? And I actually see in the Q&A, in the questions people raise, they feel quite similarly. So I think that's a good sign. So maybe to start off with the first one, if that's okay, from Claudia, and she asks, give attention to the right thing. How do you know which is the right thing? Sometimes I have the feeling I have too much on my plate and everything seems important or the right thing to focus on.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and obviously impossible to answer from the perspective of actually saying what the right thing is, because that's really up to you. So Claudia, if you're still listening, I would like to invite you to make that list, make it explicit, put it on paper. Use the urgency versus importance quadrants to indicate which things are really urgent, which are really important, and also focus on what is important for work, what is important for my social life, what is important for my health, what is important for my kids, my partner, whatever. And try to make an explicit overview of what you think is most important, and then just cut down. Because there is only one person truly focusing in your mental health, and that's yourself. So actually saying what is most important is impossible, but how could be using that quadrant style. But there are way more tips towards deciding what to do. Learning to say no is such an important thing. If you look on YouTube for videos about how to say no, I mean, there books have been written about it. There are podcasts on it. I mean, podcast is one of my favorite things to go to get into this new information. But I would like to highly encourage you into getting into these hows yourself, finding those things that work for you.
I think that's actually very interesting, because I do recognize, and I think a lot of people from the audience will as well, that you can decide for yourself what is most important. But if a lot of people around you ask something from you, in the end, we are also social beings.
Yep.
So how do you handle that? So indeed, like learning how to say no and then setting your own boundaries in a polite and respectful manner is probably critical.
That's critical indeed. And I experienced that with a lot of people, especially around the developmental age, going from like young professional to media or senior. There is oftentimes the element where people experience a lot of difficulties in saying no, because they want to do it right, and they want to satisfy other people, they want to show that they are able to do things. But knowing where you want to go and deciding upon that, what you're going to do and what not, that can truly help you. But indeed, that's a difficult thing, because we are very sociable creatures.
It's also our power, yeah. And then Amy is asking, do you have any tips on dealing with procrastination? Sometimes I find it hard to focus because I want to be distracted.
It's the nature of our brain to focus on system one. System one is the easy system. It doesn't take effort. So sure, leave your phone open, put it with the screen up and see it highlight. Notifications come by, or even better, random thoughts occur in your head. What's that recipe? I'd like to bake tomorrow. Let's check out the recipe. Instead of doing that most important task. The best tip for procrastination is just start. Take your most important thing and get started. And even better, if you want to start it tomorrow and you know that tonight you can spare 5 minutes, get to think about it. Because psychologically, you're opening a drawer, and in your unconscious mind, in your sleep, in your rest, your brain is actively working on that. So most creativity arises from good sleep. And that's a very interesting fact when you actually know that and apply that. So procrastination. Type it into YouTube. There are some great lectures and TEDx lectures about procrastination. And I mean, the most important part in procrastination is just starting on the task. The moment you're in the task, it's way harder to stop than getting started to begin with.
So make it small and start.
Yeah.
Do you have any specific tips on either TEDx, YouTube videos for the audience to look into?
If you take TEDx and type in procrastination, I told you, Marjolein, I'm bad with names. So I don't know the guy anymore, but there is a TEDx presentation about procrastination. That's just an amazing TEDx, because he procrastinated on his TEDx. And he tells us about it, and it takes us on the journey. So I think it's not only entertaining, but it's also insightful. Honestly, you can give so many tips. And that's why I also have this overview of 15 tips. I have the 15 commandments on a one-pager with 15 hows on how to do that. I'm happy to share those as well. But that's why I didn't go into the how, because it's so specific. I mean, I'm a very rational and scientific person. So I'm logical, I'm quite linear in my thinking. That's my predominant side. But for other people, that works differently. So that's why I think giving tips on the how, there is no one size fits all. It's very important to equip yourself with the capacity of finding these things yourself. And luckily, we have the internet. You have books, you have podcasts, you have videos. It's just amazing what you can find online.
There's plenty of inspiration. Definitely. Well, Sven also has a follow-up question, again, on resources. And he asks if you have any useful resources for discovering life goals, driving forces, and or core values.
For the core values, I have a great book. It's in Dutch, though. I'm not sure if it's translated. I need to look that up, actually. It's called The Core, but then in Dutch, De Kern. It's already 20 years old, but it deals with all the core values very well.
You know who's the author?
No, but it is it's from Lingsma publisher.
Okay.
It's actually a company, and they wrote a book. It's a journalist who followed a training in that company about discovering your core, and he wrote a book about it.
Okay.
But I'm not sure if it's available in English. So I have to withhold on that answer. Sorry.
Let's see. Maybe to add to what Jérôme already said, also OpenUp can help you here. So we have an intimate group session on discovering your values. I definitely recommend to join that session and learn from others, but also learn from our psychologist. And of course, our psychologist can also help on this aspect. Then the last question, a question from Aravind, and he asks, I feel constantly overwhelmed by all the myriad of self-care activities, cultivating healthy habits, mindset, etc. As we said, a lot of inspiration.
Yeah.
How do I navigate these feelings of overwhelm?
Yeah, yeah. I think this really taps in nicely into the elements that I highlighted in my talk about signals that give you the feeling that you're probably not already on the right track in that regard. And feelings of overwhelming is an indication that you just expect too much of yourself, and the result can be that you, in the end, are not doing the things that get you there. How do you navigate that? Make choices. Make deliberate choices. Journaling, we discussed that in the Dutch session before. Journaling is a great way in the evening to reflect. I always, if I do journaling, I do it in the evening. You know, it's the day has gone. I know that I won't go into new tasks anymore because I just don't have the energy, but it's very easy to do 5 minutes of journaling. To think about, what is the one thing that I want to do tomorrow that brings me further? What is my experience of today? And I just free write on things. What are the 3 things that I was most grateful for today? Do that for a month. It takes you 5 minutes each evening. Write it down somewhere. Read it back. What is your line in it? What are your predominant points? What is the one thing you want to do every day? Is that thing appearing every day and it's not working? You make sure that it works. In the morning, you focus on the task. You start with it. So I think it's a very valid question, but in the end, you yourself are the one who needs to make the choices. And, well, that can be a hard statement, honestly, but in the end, no one is going to do the work for you.
I think a very good suggestion to also wrap up this masterclass with. So reflection and setting intentions.
Yes, setting intentions.
And with that, I just would like to thank you again. It was really a pleasure and a lot of room for thought.
Thank you for having me, Marjolein.
Thanks also to the audience for joining and being so interactive also in doing so. As you know by now, we host these masterclasses on a monthly basis. So really hope to see you again in July. The topic of that masterclass will be around the gut-brain connection and mental well-being. Thank you.
Thank you.